So this video is going to be about the American Civil Rights Movement and a couple other things like the Jim Crow laws, World War II and civil rights, and Rosa Parks, and etc. So how the Civil Rights Movement began. It was started by African Americans to end racial discrimination and segregation in the U.S., and they also want equal rights as everyone. So who was involved from the beginning? And these are just a couple primary figures that I picked out myself. So they were Martin Luther King Jr. himself, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, etc. The objectives for the Civil Rights Movement was for African Americans to have equal rights. The American Civil Rights Movement was in the mid-1950s. The American Civil Rights Movement was in the mid-1950s. The American Civil Rights Movement took place in 1955, December 1st in Montgomery, Alabama. The American Civil Rights Movement all started when one strong woman named Rosa Parks did not give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama to a white man who wanted her seat because she was in the front and the African Americans were supposed to sit in the back. Now these next 13 little subtopics all have to do. The Jim Crow laws is a collection of state and local laws that legalize racial segregation. When World War II started, all the white men went to go fight in the war and practically had to lose their jobs. So all the African Americans came in and filled in the positions that the white men left. So when the white men came back from after fighting in the war, they practically came home to not having a job, since all the African Americans, or most of the African Americans, filled in their positions as they were needed to be filled. Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated bus where African Americans were supposed to sit in the back and whites were supposed to sit in the front. Since she did this wonderful act, she sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Little Rock 9 is when 9 African American kids enrolled into Little Rock High School in 1957. After they had enrolled, they were prevented from going to the racially segregated school by the governor of Kansas, Orville Fubus. They finally got to attend after the intervention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The 9 African American kids who started this movement was Melba Patillo, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckfield, Minnie Jean Brown, Terrence Roberts, Carolina Walsh, Jefferson Thomas, Gloria Ray, and Thelma Mothershed. The Civil Rights Act of 1959 was the first federal civil rights legislation passed by the United Congress since the Civil Rights Act of 1815. This bill was passed by the 85th U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Dwight D. Woolworth lunch counter is a section of standard wood, stainless steel, and chrome lunch counters from Woolworth's Five and Dine in Greensboro, North Carolina. It has been preserved in the National Museum of American History because it was there in the series of Greensboro sit-in, a protest against racial segregation caused by Jim Crow laws. The Freedom Riders is a group of white and African American civil rights activists who participated in the Freedom Bus Rides trips through the American South in 1961 to protest against segregated bus terminals. The March on Washington is a massive protest that happened in August 1963. Over 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil right and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and it prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools and other public places, and employment discrimination. Bloody Sunday, otherwise known as the Bauxite Massacre, happened on January 30th, 1972 in the Bauxite area of Perry, Northern Ireland, when British soldiers shot 26 civilians during the protest march against internment without trial. 14 people died, 13 died outright, while the other man died later, about 2-3 months later after his injuries from being shot. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is an act that prohibits racial discrimination for voting. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 is a federal legislation that protects individuals and families from discrimination in finding, rental, financing, and advertising of housing. Some civil rights leaders that were oh my god, some civil rights leaders that were assassinated during the whole civil rights movement, and these are just some of them that I picked out, were Martin Luther King Jr. himself, Roger Evans, Malcolm X, and others.